Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. As the title of this video suggests, we're discussing cannabis yet again. This issue has kind of been at the forefront of some news here in Thailand because, quite honestly, this government, and I kind of put that in quotes because I'm really not sure they have the parliamentary votes at any given moment in the parliament to really actually continue being the government. That seems to be kind of a tenuous thing. But for whatever reason, they've arbitrarily and capriciously decided that they're going to go after cannabis here, notwithstanding the fact it was legalized some years back, and without any legal authority, in my opinion, especially pursuant to the doctrine of codification, where there's been no law promulgated through Parliament to illegalize cannabis or to regulate it. You know, they're still trying to go after it. But what I think is interesting has been the push in a media sense to go after it. I thought of making this video after reading a recent article from the Bangkok Post, bangkokpost.com. Article is titled, "Cannabis Edibles Producer Raided After Toddler Intoxicated." Quoting directly, police raided an illegal cannabis edibles maker in Klong Sam Wa district of Bangkok, seizing cannabis-infused jellies and cookies worth an estimated 900,000 baht. The investigation was initiated after a report in early July about a 2-year-old girl who became drowsy and required hospitalization after consuming jelly suspected to contain cannabis. Well, okay, in early July, like what do the two have to do with one another? And why is this being pushed in the media as if, you know, they've tried this since the get-go, since cannabis got legal, that it's a massive threat to kids, it's a massive threat to kids, and they've just pushed that narrative. You know, and by they, you know, look, there's clearly interests that don't want cannabis to be legal in Thailand. You know, I would say big pharma is among them. You know, big alcohol is out there. There may even be specific special interests, as has been brought up by the Writing Cannabis Network in their petitions against certain actors in the government, saying, you know, are you putting forth regulations in order to serve specific cannabis interests at the expense of other cannabis interests? Again, as we've discussed in other videos, there's nearly 20,000 licensed shops in Thailand that have been arbitrarily and capriciously, in my opinion, harassed without proper due process of law here for the past number of weeks now, mostly based on this whole notion that certain actors within the government can just do things because they say so and don't necessarily need to pass a law. And I've talked about that at length in other videos, but again, another aspect of this has been sort of the media push, and I would love to know at whose behest, against cannabis, like this story here where, okay, it's one thing that the edibles producer was raided, but, you know, the title is After Toddler Intoxicated. It's not like some kid walked out on the street, passed out in front of the building, and the cops ran in. No, that happened in early July. There was a child, and I urge those who are watching this video, read that article for further details, but there was a child who consumed something accidentally, I think, that they thought was like a jelly, you know, jelly bean or whatever you want to call it, a jelly edible, became intoxicated and, you know, I think passed out. Now, to be clear, the child survived because, look, cannabis doesn't kill anyone, to paraphrase the gentleman, Matthew McConaughey's character in The Gentleman. I'll try to find a thumbnail for that and I'll try to put that up. But the point I'm trying to make is, look, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Anybody that gives this stuff, especially with intent, to children, we need to throw the book at that person. That person needs to do serious jail time. Children should not have anything to do with this. Now, it looks to me like there was an accident that, and I'm not justifying it, let me be clear. I think this was a bad thing. A kid, you know, becoming intoxicated on cannabis is not a good thing. Nobody thinks that. But my point is it looks to me like it's being used as a pretext to sort of push the narrative or push an anti-cannabis narrative in such a way that makes it look like, you know, kids are super susceptible to being intoxicated by this stuff, when the reality is, you know, that incident occurred some weeks before this actual raid of this unlicensed facility. And again, the issue of licensure and regulation of all of that stuff, because processed cannabis products, yes, they were subject to more intense regulatory oversight. I know this because I was told this. I went and got a cannabis license for myself at one point, mostly just to kind of do it. And I thought about getting in the business. I ultimately didn't really end up wading into that as deeply as I initially thought I would for a variety of different reasons. But I did go and get a license, and the first thing they said is, hey, you know, if you want to do processed products like edibles, you know, you need further licensing, and there's further scrutiny and investigation associated with that. So again, I'm not even saying that what anybody was doing here was the right thing to do. If they didn't have their licenses, fair enough. And if there was a kid that was intoxicated, that's no good. I think that there should be some justice brought to bear for that. But that said, to push this the way it was sort of pushed in that article, I find that disingenuous. Meanwhile, I thought again of making this video after reading another article, again from the Bangkok Post, bangkokpost.com. Article is titled, Phuket Pressed to Tackle Issues Vexing Tourists. There's a lot going on in that video, or in that article. I urge those who are watching this video, go check out that article in detail to read all the details. But quoting an excerpt, the smell of cannabis is pervasive in Phuket, and the Ministry of Public Health has not come up with a clear plan to address the issue. Well, we talked about this going all the way back to when this first happened. The Thai police have at their disposal the nuisance laws, you know, and they've talked about this whole, oh, there's the smell of cannabis. You know, I've seen this a lot, again, in the narrative, the anti-cannabis narrative. Oh, there's the smell of cannabis out on the streets and things. Well, you know, when people are out making food, like on barbecues and things out on the street, there's smoke that emanates off of that super spicy food that you'll walk by certain street vendors making that. You know, it gets in your mouth and lungs, and it actually causes me to cough sometimes. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one comparison. I don't like the idea of the smell of cannabis being pervasive across all these streets, but there's a way to deal with that. We know how to deal with that. If the police started citing people on the streets that were smoking cannabis for nuisance, especially foreigners, and there were a few news stories to that effect, I'm pretty sure pretty quickly that behavior would pretty well subside, because nobody wants to go and have to deal with the police precinct or even end up in jail on some nuisance violation. It's not like there's no laws to handle this, you know, and that's what's, again, in an anti-cannabis narrative context, it's sort of being pushed as if, oh, there's no way to deal with this. We just need to re-legalize it. Bringing up that point, quoting further, Mr. Solpon said the Ministry of Public Health is considering reclassifying cannabis as a narcotic for medical use only. Well, how are you going to do that? As I've discussed in other videos, you need to pass a law. And by the way, everybody said a year and a half ago on this issue, they were going to pass a law through Parliament. Is the reason you haven't done that is that this government would fall apart because there's not support for that legislation? So you're just trying to do it based on the basis of, oh, because we say so, it's now a narcotic? As I've discussed in other videos, what stops then? I mean, this comes down to fundamental legal principles. The doctrine of codification exists in a civil law context so that you can't just walk around willy-nilly saying, oh, this is illegal now. No, you have to go through legislative due process, make a law, make it illegal, or make a law regulating it, and then have regulations stemming therefrom. You know, to allow this for them to just say, oh, it's a narcotic now, that's like a florist should be worried at that point that they'll say orchids are narcotics. And I know that sounds rhetorical, but it's really not. This comes down to fundamental notions of freedom, fundamental notions of rule of law, that you can't just say something's illegal or say something's a narcotic because you say so. You got to go through due process of law. And yeah, I understand that this became legalized because of use of emergency powers on the part of Mr. Anutin when he pulled this off the narcotics list, but those emergency powers were codified in the Communicable Diseases Act, which was promulgated through Parliament. So when he used that power and then that power extinguished with the end of the emergency decree, it would either require the emergency decree to come back and then somebody to put it back on the narcotics list in theory, although I don't know that that works in line with the doctrine of codification that way. I think it works pulling it off. If it's in favor of more freedom, it operates. If it's in favor of less freedom, I don't think it operates. Meanwhile, the other thing to take away from this video is they need to pass a law through Parliament. And again, I question their motives on all of this. One, because it seems like, as we've discussed in other videos, it's, you know, all of this so-called regulation may be aimed at promoting certain cannabis interests to the extent of others, but it's also in deep violation of the basic notion of the doctrine of codification. Also, as we discussed in another video, the secretary to the public health minister during or in the brief aftermath after a recent protest at the public health ministry by cannabis advocates said that they would not be reclassifying it as a narcotic. So again, there's just all kinds of doublespeak and just because we say so and la la la. How about you just deal with the fact it's legal? You've got 20,000 licensed shops out there. Let's move on. You know, and how do you make something illegal when somebody has an affirmative license? Again, you might be able to do it again through legislative due process, through Parliament, but how do you do that where you just say, oh, because we say so? That's nonsense. You know, quoting further, Phuket has over 1,640 cannabis shops, but without zoning laws or enforcement authority, only public consumption can be penalized under cleanliness regulations. Who says it can only be penalized under cleanliness regulations? Again, there's nuisance laws that are out there, disturbing the peace kind of, you know, the police have powers to deal with folks who are being a nuisance on the street. Okay, this notion that, oh, it's so terrible. That's why I say this childishness needs to end. Okay, pass a law, or if in the absence of that, enforce the laws as they are on the books, but stop trying to do this arbitrary and capricious stuff just because certain interests don't like cannabis in Thailand.